I'm Jack Halliday from PECAN, and on his behalf I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Yalukit Wheel and Clan of the Boon Wurrung and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. I'd like to welcome you all, and also the Federal Member for McNamara, Josh Burns, State MLC Nina Taylor, and councillors and staff from Port Phillip and Bayside. The Port Phillip Emergency Climate Action Network was formed in September, and around the same time the Port Phillip Council declared a climate emergency. It's a network of 12 environment and community groups energised by the climate emergency. These were the groups which ran the McNamara Candidates Forum in April last year at St Kilda Town Hall. The Australian Conservation Foundation in McNamara was one of those groups, and PECAN thanks them for their continuing support. This is the first event that we've run, and we are planning regular forums on an ongoing basis. Our purpose today is to link the impact of the rapid climate change we've seen over the last 6 months, the bushfires and the floods, with what that means locally, with sea level rise, flooding and the build-up of more frequent heat events in urban areas. Your attendance here today shows that there's widespread concern in our community about effective response to climate change. And we hope that you'll act on that urgency by linking with the groups here today and assisting in their work. The Bayside Climate Crisis Action Group has joined PECAN in hosting this forum, and I'd like to ask David Rothfield from BCCAG to say a few words on its behalf.
Thanks, Jack. The Bayside Climate Crisis Action Group is delighted to co-host this event with PECAN to help highlight the issues that will increasingly impact foreshore communities, including in Port Phillip and Bayside. No doubt some of what we hear today will be troubling, but the first step to motivate action is to know the truth. I'm glad to say that PECAN's work with Bayside Council over the past 12 months has brought home the truth of climate risk to all its councillors and its senior staff. It was the council's organisation that made the recommendation. Sorry, I hope. Such a difference. Should I start again? So it was the council, I'm talking about Bayside Council, it was the council's organisation that made the recommendation on which council acted with unanimity to declare a climate emergency and to develop an action plan with funds and a timetable to develop that plan. Their program of community consultation is well underway and has produced an unprecedented wave of interest and responses in Bayside. I'm confident that what we hear from this distinguished panel today will embolden us all to demand of our local governments to plan a transition to a zero carbon economy for the whole community, and to shame the state and federal governments to step up and make it happen for all of Australia.
David, and now some quick housekeeping items. The toilets are off to the foyer, on your left as you came in through the front door, and in the event of any emergency, the exits are on both sides of the theatre, the door you came in on and one on that side there opposite. Clipboards will be passed around so we can see that we have your details to stay in touch for future events and mail-outs. We will be asking for donations later in the forum. Our fantastic speakers and moderators are generously giving us their time, but printing, venue hire and publicity costs are considerable, and we hope we can collect enough today to cover these costs and hopefully have a little bit left over for future events. There will be a credit card facility also available in the foyer at the end of the forum. Now on your seat you'll find two documents, a yellow one for Port Phillip residents, the orange one for Bayside. These documents provide information about the groups active in the respective municipalities and provide contact details for them. Several of these groups will also be at tables in the foyer and outside after the forum and can give you more information about the work they're doing to help you make up your mind about which to connect with. There's also a smaller blue form. If there are audience members with particular expertise or experience in environmental issues, we hope you may be able to offer your assistance and advice in our ongoing program. Peter, can you remind me of the name of that?
The Can You Help sheets.
The Can You Help sheets, so please don't overlook them on your way out. The event's being live streamed and the Facebook link can be found in the PECAN document on your seat or on the PECAN banner over on that side of the stage. For anyone wishing to tweet from this forum, we suggest you use the hashtags listed on the screen and also on the PECAN sheet. And I should foreshadow that before the forum's finished, a resolution will be put to a vote requesting strong action by local, state and Commonwealth governments. Finally, before handing over to our moderator, I'd ask that questions and discussions are conducted in a respectful manner. As David said, we're all aware there are differing views about some of the issues that we'll be talking about, but to use an apt metaphor, we're seeking light, not heat, this afternoon. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Esther Avram. Esther's had over, she's at the end of the table nearest to me. Esther's had over 20 years' experience in not-for-profit environment organisations. She was Director of Environment Victoria for 5 years before becoming the inaugural CEO of the Moreland Energy Foundation in 2001. Now recently become the Melbourne Energy Foundation as its work gets ever more broadly distributed. She subsequently worked at Changemakers Australia and following that consulted extensively on strategic direction and policy development to government and not-for-profits. Since 2017 she's been the Giving Green Manager at the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. Please join me in welcoming Esther.
Jack, and thank you everyone for having me. Good afternoon. It's an absolutely amazing day out there, but clearly you are all very interested in the topic that we're about to hear about because we've got a full house tonight or this afternoon. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Boonwurrung people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This afternoon, we've come together to learn more about the impacts of climate change on your community. 20 years ago, scientists from the CSIRO put out some very usable information for the community which told us that the eastern and southern states of Australia were going to become drier as a result of climate change. In recent months, we've learned a very harsh lesson about what that actually means. 7 years of drought across large parts of the east of our country. Ferocious bushfires have wiped communities off the map and destroyed large amounts of some of our best old growth forests in East Gippsland. We have been really shocked and horrified by what we've experienced. Climate change has our attention. One of the clear lessons from bushfires is that we need to be prepared. But you can't prepare for something if you don't know if it's going to happen, or if you have ideological bent that blinds you to things that you don't want to hear about. So that's why the format of today's session is very much focused on increasing our collective knowledge about two very significant impacts of climate change, which we actually don't hear a great deal about. Sea level rise and flooding, and the heat island effect. These are very pertinent issues for most Australians because most Australians live in cities and we also tend to live along the coast. They're also extremely important issues for the people of Port Phillip and Bayside. So this afternoon we've got 3 presentations from experts who bring deep general understanding of those issues and also some really great local knowledge as well. Following the presentations, there's going to be an opportunity for questions from the audience, but we are going to run those presentations back to back. So, to get things started, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Professor Nigel Tapper. Professor Tapper holds a personal chair in environmental science at Monash University, where he leads the Applied Climate Research Group within the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment. He's a strong contributor to the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where he's the lead author of the working group on impacts, mitigation and adaptation. With his research background, we're extremely fortunate to have Nigel this afternoon to talk to us about urban heat islands and urban hotspots and what we can do to mitigate them. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you, Esther, for the welcome, and I'm delighted to be here. So I am going to be talking about urban, and I am going to be talking about urban heat. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time talking about urban heat island theory and processes and so on, because I've only got 15 minutes, and the first 5 minutes of that I want to talk a little bit about background to climate change, current climate change. Then I will go on to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing that is relevant to your part of the world. The work that we've been doing, particularly on what we can do to cool cities under climate change. Okay, so I don't know if you've ever seen this. You're probably wondering what this is. It looks like a nice stripe of wallpaper. Well, in actual fact, this is Australia warming 2010 to 2019. Wow. It's known as the warming stripes diagram, and basically we take the lowest temperature in the series and give that a really deep blue, and we take the warmest temperature in the series, give that the darkest red, and we then distribute every other year between them. And it's quite remarkable, obviously, as you can see. So there's this is a sort of a warming trend you don't normally see, but it's unequivocal. And many of you probably know that 2019 was Australia's hottest year on record. It was 1.5 degrees above the 1960 to 1990 long-term average. And more than that, the mean maximum temperature was over 2 degrees warmer than the long-term maximum. These are remarkable temperatures, as you can well understand. It was also Australia's driest year on record, so it is no wonder that the end of the year ended with massive fires, the expanse of which we've never seen before. Okay, well this is sort of the temperature curve that you're more likely to recognise, but again it's showing the temperature change from 1910 to 2019 across Australia, and the anomaly as calculated from the 1961 to 1990 average. And of course, there we are, 2019, 1.52 degrees. So, what this means is that in many ways, if we keep repeating these years, we're pretty much already at that 1.5 degrees of global warming that we've been talking about trying to avoid. So, not only in Australia, but all around the world in the observational record, you know, we have had continuing temperature rise through to, well, this is from the 1.5 degree report through to 2017. And on those projections, we look likely globally to hit 1.5 degrees by 2040. So we're very much on track for that warming, and maybe to hit it earlier, particularly maybe in some parts of the world. 16, 18 and 19 have all tracked globally above 1 degree above the long-term average. And just to finish off with July 2019, it was exceptionally warm. It was the hottest month ever recorded globally at 1.5 degrees centigrade above normal. So it's not just about average temperatures. what's really critical in urban areas and in terms of human health is extreme heat. It's those extreme conditions that are also increasing even more markedly than mean temperatures. So if we just have a look at the current number of days in Australia, Adelaide, Brisbane, etc., Melbourne down here, Sydney, above 40 degrees centigrade, and then look at the projections in 2030 under the modest increase in emissions, 2090 under the modest increase in emissions, and the higher emissions scenario, which is what we're probably tracking at the moment, we can see that Melbourne is going to move from something like 1.6 days on average above 40 each year to as much as 6.8 in terms of the median in 2090 under RCP 8.5, and then in between for the other projections. And then if we look at the sort of error bars, if you like, we could be as high as 11 days in Melbourne. Okay, so clearly we've got a problem with extreme heat. And that really comes back to, I guess, a decision that we made in my research group about 10, 12 years ago, maybe even further ago than that. What can we do to increase the resilience of our cities in the face of climate change? So our work here in Australia has focused on two areas: improved public health warnings or heat warnings, and improved emergency services preparedness to save lives. Now I can't talk very much about that today, I will mention it. And secondly, finding solutions to make our cities cooler to save lives and also to protect city infrastructure from extreme heat. Some of you may or may not have seen this diagram, but it's actually quite an important one because it's the basis of the Victorian and Melbourne heat warning system that is issued by the Bureau of Meteorology and the Department of Health ahead of heatwave conditions in Melbourne. This one's for Melbourne. So what we did was, way back in 2008, we took 5, 10, 20,000, I can't remember, records, and we looked at mean daily temperatures across those records and the mortality anomaly on every one of those days. And we plotted that. And what we found was that if we took a look at a mean daily temperature of 30 degrees, which in Melbourne means a 40-degree day followed by a 20-degree overnight, then we have a threshold temperature at about 30 mean daily temperature. And above that, the death rate jumps up, approaching 20%. And this is for people in the older part of the community. But one thing that is really quite significant about this is that a small drop in temperature at that threshold level means that you can literally save lives by dropping temperature. So that has been, to a large extent, the basis of a lot of the work we've done in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in the last sort of 5 to 10 years at Monash, to see what we can do in the community to mitigate heat, urban design, and by doing whatever technically we can to reduce temperatures. The other thing that we did that I'll very briefly mention is we also developed a heat vulnerability index for all of the Australian capital cities, and that was at the postcode level. Because what we found was that people don't die at the same rates all over the city. There are pockets of excess deaths, there are pockets where people don't die at the same rate or don't get ill at the same rate. So we identified a whole bunch of risk factors that we were able to apply at the postcode level, and then we were able to map all of the capital cities using those criteria, and we also were able to test against things like ambulance pickups or hospital admissions and so on. And we're able to show that there was a very strong relationship between our vulnerability index and these independent variables. So the aim is to drop temperatures and to address vulnerability, to address those hotspots of heat vulnerability in the community. So we have taken a range of approaches: observational, remote sensing, modelling, database mapping, from individual tree work right up to neighbourhood and to city level work. And the whole idea of that work is, what can we do to moderate exchanges of heat between the human body and the environment, particularly when the environmental temperatures are substantially higher than body temperature. Because once that happens, then the flows of energy, instead of away from the body, they tend to be toward the body. And because we were working through the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities that funded most of our research, our focus has been on water and green infrastructure. And we've been working fundamentally at two levels. We've been looking at the micro scale, which is sort of at the backyard to household to streetscape. And the idea there is to reduce air temperature and radiant temperatures in the environment to improve human thermal comfort and health outcomes. And then at the larger scale, at the top, to reduce local scale air temperature to limit heat health impacts. So if you look carefully at that diagram, and I know it'd be pretty hard for you to see, there are a whole range of things, of treatments we can take using irrigated green infrastructure and green infrastructure, trees, shrubs and so on, to reduce temperatures. These are some examples, local examples from around Melbourne and elsewhere, of bioswales on the roadside, open water bodies, lakes, all sorts of different approaches. Things like green roofs, green walls, all of these things come into it. Just before I kind of follow up and finish with some case studies, we also developed a climate tool for prioritising implementation of water-sensitive urban design, and that was piloted in the city of Port Phillip. And fundamentally, we took our vulnerability analysis at the postcode or smaller level. We combined it with thermal mapping and also intersected with areas of large population exposure, like train stations, car parks and so on. And then we were able to identify areas where there were different degrees of intersection. And of course, C, where heat, vulnerability and behavioural exposure all overlap, is a particularly important area for heat mitigation, for treatment, if you like. And here we are in the city of Port Phillip, and you can see that there are a few black spots around and lots of yellow, orange and green spots. So it's this sort of tool that enables local councils, and this tool is now being used all over Australia by many councils, to identify areas for heat treatment, for cooling, for whatever way they can. So just to kind of talk through, how long have we got?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Very. That was a quick 15 minutes. Okay, so we've got summer cooling at micro scale. So we're looking here at the micro scale level, and what we find is that if we look at things like green walls, roadside trees, bioswales, bioretention, rain gardens, stormwater harvesting, all of these sorts of things at the local scale, and we do a range of experiments, we can actually show that we get a range of cooling that is provided by each of these activities. So at the microscale, from the work that we've done, the work we've published in probably 20 or 30 publications, we can achieve air temperature cooling of 1 or 2 degrees and feels like cooling, thermal comfort cooling of 7 to 10 degrees. Now, if we move from that micro scale to the city-wide scale, we find that, the work that we've done, for example, on large parks, on suburban scale irrigation, on citywide reforestation and changing the vegetation fraction and surface albedo across the city, we can also, under extreme heat conditions, achieve air temperature cooling of around 2 degrees centigrade. So the last 2 or 3 slides I had were really about showing you some case study examples, which I obviously don't have time to do now. But what I would just like to finish with is by saying that, sure, we have this progressive increase in global temperature and in Australia. And cities are particularly vulnerable to these increases in temperature because they're warmer environments anyway. But we can do things to mitigate the issues, not that adaptation to heat is necessarily our preferred way. We'd rather not have the heat there in the first place. But we can, using a range of technologies, reduce that heat load on the city and on the city inhabitants. And we can also do things like improve emergency services through developing heat warning systems and advising the ambulance and hospitals of days when we're going to have excessive temperature. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
That way you get
Thanks
more
very
shown.
much,
You do it the other
Nigel.
way,
And,
you can't see much.
I guess what I was hearing during that presentation was that what we actually need to do is have more trees, more things like ornamental lakes, more vegetation, like how bad would that be to actually have some more beautiful green spaces? And of
Because I'm
course
streaming
those
like
trees
that.
will be drawing in carbon emissions as well. So,
I don't know.
so that's great. Thank you, Nigel. So our second speaker is Rob Gell, who's a geographer and coastal geomorphologist with a lengthy experience in environmental advocacy and environmental communications. He's been actively involved in many reputable organisations that promote environmental sustainability in quite a few different ways, including being a member of the Victorian Coastal Council. In 2014, he was made a member of the General Division of the Order of Australia for significant service to conservation, to the protection of coastal and marine environments, and to the community. So really, Rob's the perfect person now to talk to us about sea level rise, implications for local governments and property occupiers. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, as I think some disreputable organisations as well. But may I acknowledge our special guests. I'm too good to see you, Josh, and others here today. I am going to just, I went and did this when we had the opportunity earlier. May I also say, acknowledge the Bunurong people, and may I say in their language, thanks for having us. Nangojin Yaraga wan Nanjinu Bikut. We should all learn to be able to speak some parts of Indigenous language wherever we can. So I'm a coastal geomorphologist. Don't ask me, we can talk about what that is later. But this is where I reckon we sort of are now. And I found this slide by chance this morning. I'm just looking through, making sure I had some good stuff. And I was reminded of this comment that was made to me in the street about 6 years ago. I must have been high on my horse at that stage talking about climate. But anyway, we persist. What I really like talking about is really lovely landscapes like this. Now, do you recognise this? This is Swan Island, Queenscliff. and it's just beautiful. For a coastal geomorphologist, this is the sort of stuff that just loves. We've got changes in shorelines here. In fact, these are prograding shorelines. You can see the ridges, look how the sand's accumulating there, one after the other, and that shoreline's growing out into the sea. It's actually coming from down here. There's a prograding shoreline here, and there's actually one here as well if we look at it a bit more closely. And in fact, that land there has been deposited in my lifetime.
Wow.
Most people don't think, so we got Sea Road ferries, this great big thing here, Parks Victoria, that wasn't there when I was a kid, but it's there now because of the seawalls to get boats in and out of that entrance into Swan Bay. So that's a time thing, that's what geographers do. We can concerned about time and distance. We're going to concentrate on a few of those things today. I want to talk to you about waves as well, because they're pretty important as well. Waves have a lot of energy, lots and lots and lots and lots. In this example here, wave A is 2 times the height of wave B, and wave A has 4 times the energy. So you know that when you go and jump in the surf, right? A 1 metre wave, you get a 2 metre wave that has 4 times the energy of the wave you surfed in yesterday. And if we look at a wave that's 2 kilometres long, 14 metres wide, 2 metres in height, it's got as much energy in it as your house for a day. They're very important things. Waves are interesting. In deep water, a particle of water actually doesn't move. It just goes around in an orbital motion, in more or less in deep water. As it gets towards the coast, it sort of trips up on the sand, and that orbital motion decreases. So these are waves in deep water. Importantly to note, when the depth of water is half the wavelength, the distance between the wave crests, the wave feels bottom and stands up and changes and starts to feel bottom and starts to approach the shoreline. And here there's not much energy left. The energy is absorbed, in fact, as the wave breaks on the sand, and then that's the swash zone. If you put a seawall there and the wave breaks on the seawall, the energy is not dissipated, and energy goes back out to sea and takes the sand with it. It's an important thing to remember. We've known that since the 1930s. Here's a pretty local, now this is really coming back to third year university thing. Black rock sandstone, the stuff at the top there, and the red bluff sandstone, about 3 or 4 million years old, Pliocene sands. A couple of things, some ridiculous structures here, trying to do something that, I don't know what they're for. They're certainly not achieving their outcome, because they're certainly not putting sand on the beach, as you can see, because there's a whole lot of things at play here. So the waves are cutting back at the shoreline, as they would do. The other thing that's happening that's important is runoff is running off the top of the cliff and eroding those cliffs from the top. That's fluvial runoff. Now both of those processes, both of those processes provide sand to the beach. If you put a seawall there, you stop that sand supply to the beach as well. Now the other thing to note, these are local waves in Port Phillip. These are not swell waves. These are local wind-driven waves. And wind has a really important impact here as well. Look at a couple of examples of what happens on this shoreline. And this is just normal conditions. Now these are wind-driven waves on Kerford Street Pier back in 2005. We had 2 days of 50-knot southerly winds. Not only does the wind produce waves, it actually piles water up in the northern end of the bay, so the water height increases. The other thing I forgot to mention about waves, waves in deep water have much more energy than waves in shallow water. You know that too. If you go surfing on the ocean beach at high tide, those waves tend to have much more energy, and they do. So you increase the water depth for whatever reason, maybe it's through wind, the waves have more energy. And so we get these sort of impacts. Now, in this case, here's a coastal barrier system overlaying lagoon peat deposits. Now, they weren't deposited on the open ocean coast, they were deposited in a lagoon. So you've got to assume that barrier has been pushed back. There's something happening here. This is a dynamic foreshore. And you have to assume also that the planners in Gippsland really weren't so stupid as to put a surf club in a spot where it might fall into the sea, but it has now. Here's another example. This is Yamba.
Wow.
Now, were these engineers stupid as well? They weren't. There was changes happening, and there had changes gradually, and they're happening over time. Old Bar in New South Wales, very smart. Rob Stokes, the Minister now, was the Minister for Environment. He's an environmental lawyer, and he stopped the building of a $50 million seawall as soon as he got into office. He said, well, that's bloody stupid. That's not going to stop a thing. So we got a situation now where it's heartbreaking indeed that storms are ripping into our beaches. And why would we expect that? Well, this one's at Stockton Beach just this month. And we're looking at ways that we're going to try and manage this problem. So looking for early warning system. Here's an example. Now this is coastal erosion. This is pretty cool technology. It's in the newspaper. So this photograph is of North Narrabeen in January the 30th, and this in the paper, and you can slide backwards and forwards. It's the same beach just about a fortnight later. So these are dynamic situations that are happening on our coastlines all the time. And there's all sorts of new, so BASF, huge German chemical company, looking at ways, you know that when you walk through the city you find those little pebbly bits around trees that have got little, right? They absorb 70% of the water that flows on top of them. Now they're now building equivalent of seawalls using the same sort of stuff, so getting the water fall in and be absorbed rather than running back the coast. We're looking at really new technical ways of protecting coastlines physically. You got to ask the question though, why would you build a surf club there? A new one. Right, this is the new Fairhaven Lifesaving Club.
Jesus Christ.
Give me a break, give me a break. And then there's this, I was going to put something on this, I actually was detained by an officer of the law with a few of my mates in Purdue University because we hung a banner on the top of, under this thing that said, engineering masterpiece, ecological disaster. And so it is. Who knows why do we have land slips on the Great Ocean Road? Because there's a road there. The sediments are bedded like this. If you put a notch in it and cut the road there, the sediments are going to fall down, especially if there's high rainfall. So what do we do, Vic Roads? Spend $100 million on a concrete wall. Are they going to concrete the entire Great Ocean Road in my granddaughter's lifetime? It's nonsensical. The road should be inland like it is in the eastern part of the state. So, and particularly when we've already had events like this. Many of you will know, driving into Apollo Bay, there's these big cypress trees. In 2006, this is a storm surge already coming across the road 14 years ago, and that's only going to get worse. What I didn't do was start my watch. How much time have I got left? 6 minutes left. 6 minutes left. Okay, good. So, the weather's crazy. Well, no, it's not really the weather. There's a lovely cartoon I found again in the last couple of days. And it says, and this is what we do, we've been doing. Well, I don't talk about global warming, I've just denied that. It's too hard to even contemplate. I can't do anything about it. I have to deny that that's even happening. So the guy said, well, let's talk about something else. And he comes back with, well, I wonder how acidic the oceans are really going to get. What's going to happen to fish? And if we think about that, well, I see our Extinction Rebellion folks up there. Hi guys, well done. The other part of, the thing that we're not discussing whilst we're discussing climate, and these guys are, quite valuably, probably I think a greater short-term problem that we have is global ecosystems are in collapse. Germans had 70%, they lost 70% of their insects in the national parks a decade ago. They're trying to fix it now. There's neonicotinoid poisons and all sorts of stuff. We lost 900 million monarch butterflies in the space of 2 or 3 years, a few years ago. So these are the things that fundamentally provide us with food and support our economy, and we're blind to it. Let's not dwell on that.
Depress everyone.
The other issue that we have is that we also know that our climate scientists have been ridiculously conservative. So this paper here, this is just published I think a couple of days ago, basically saying these fires we've seen not even consistent with the models. We weren't expecting these sort of fires until the end of the century on the modelling. Scientists have been way too conservative. Scientists are, they're very conservative people. They don't push the envelope in the other direction. But when you hear, being called a scaremonger, I'm not being a scaremonger, I'm presenting the conservative science. Not the other end of the spectrum. There's some scientists who want to go harder, but all the evidence we have is they haven't been preaching loud enough. Although, and we've also got this situation where, so the world's oceans, this is a bit of physics again, the world's oceans are absorbing 90% of the heat from the greenhouse effect. So the oceans are getting warm. Now remember, go back to first or second year science, and you do that thing with a brass ball going through a little ring. You heat up the ball, and it won't go through the ring anymore. Okay, that's expand. Things can heat up and they expand. This is where we've been measuring sea level until now, just by thermal expansion of the surface waters of the ocean. So Thermal expansion of surface water gives us sea level rise, and that's what's really being measured in the model so far. We know there are things happening in the Arctic, but this is a bit like the ice cube in your glass of scotch, right? When the ice cube melts, it doesn't actually change the level. It's floating on the sea, but it's certainly indicative of a warmer ocean, and what it's doing is exposing more dark ocean, which absorbs more radiant heat, which makes the oceans warmer. So we've got a feedback loop there as well. But it's all about natural availability. A long-term trend is downwards. More importantly, though, we now are looking at land-based ice. This is ice in Greenland and in Antarctica, and this is now melting as well. In this particular, sorry, I've got to click the button. And this curve is frightening because this ice is melting very, very fast, much faster than anybody thought. No one actually really thought we were going to get much melting in Antarctica for a long, long time. But you can see the trend is, in fact, much the same as the trend we're seeing in Greenland, although Greenland started earlier. So you get the picture. What are we expecting? Well, the fifth assessment report in 2013 says between 0.26 and 0.98 increase in sea level by 2100. But that didn't include ice sheet melting, Antarctica and Greenland, not really. Victorian Coastal Strategy that I was part of, we got through 0.8 metres by 2100, 80 centimetres. NOAA, a couple of years ago, are now saying 2.7 metres by 2100. The Greenland ice sheets could be 6 or 7 metres. Big numbers. I want to just quickly run through this paper. This is a lovely paper by Georgia Warren Myers, and it's sort of on a hypothetical Melbourne coastal municipality, looking at what all this stuff means. And they look at potential losses through sea level rise, and they identify direct losses through inundation and flooding, total damage and loss, indirect losses, so loss of rent, revenue, things like that, periodic or permanent damage to property and property value decline. Then there are consequential losses like secondary costs from repercussions and more depreciation, human loss, people get injured and hurt, aid and emergency costs from floods. Then there's losses to natural capital, to natural ecosystems as well, and heritage value. So this comes in a sort of a cascading effect in the water on the land where it hasn't been in the past. So it's not just about real estate, it's not just about structures, it's about the communities and individuals behind it. Here's some really good numbers. So here's sea level rise over here, and looking at the numbers right through there's a +1 metre, but this is number of properties affected. But then we go and look at, okay, sea level rise plus flood levels. So often with a big storm, not only do you get wave action at the shore and wave piling up, but you get more rainfall, so you get a flood with it as well. And then we look at plug in the high tide, the highest tide, and then plug in the storm surge with that, and you get different numbers, and this is what we need to be thinking about. So if we look at, for example, +1 metre of sea level rise gives us, well, we got, you need all this to get up to 44% with all of these things. But for the short term, you'd say, well, +1 metre sea level rise only going to influence 0.27% of properties. But if we look at 20 centimetres, which in fact is where we are now, we're already 20 centimetres above, with a flood level of 1.8, if we take it right through, we get a flood plus a high tide plus a storm surge, we're going to influence 27% of properties today. And we're not doing much about it. So what do we need to do? I'm just wrapping up now. So this shows us that a rise of 1 metre of sea level might not be huge in this study area, but it's not about that. It's about the complications of tides, winds and precipitation and storms all acting together to bring us higher water levels with more energy and having more impact. So the number of affected properties disproportionately increases with those things, with those natural dynamic systems we see all the time. There is very little engagement of public and private stakeholders at this stage. I mean, this is about the best you get currently, the sort of engagement on these sort of issues. The value implications are a clear concern. The property sector is either blind or just doesn't want to go there when you're buying or selling your house in Elwood, for example, and they should be. The escalation of impacts of extreme events will question and test the capacity of local councils, and it clearly is, to manage economically and legally. This is a minefield. We really haven't addressed it in 17 years I was on the Victorian Coastal Council, we really didn't get it out. Thank you. During the week, my good mate Chris sent this to me, paying his rates at the City of Port Phillip, and noted total property value 3.5 trillion properties estimated by the council. So he says if you very conservatively take 1% of that affected by climate change and sea level rise, that's 35 billion. That's 270 years of the council's full annual budget expected of 130 million. Right? So in terms of the asset, we're really not dealing with the issue. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Rob, and I can hear that a lot of you are talking and thinking about that presentation, because that's actually pretty confronting stuff, isn't it, when you consider just that small level of sea level rise and you add up those other things that that come together in a coastal area. You know, the impact that it has, the extent of the area that actually gets impacted. It's incredible that there isn't more conversations about this topic. And I think, you know, going back to what Rob was talking about at the very beginning, about the whole thing about the way coasts operate. You know, we love beaches, we love the coasts in Australia, but we really don't have a clue, really, do we, about how they function, you know, and perhaps that's at the, you know, one of the things that's really holding us back. So thank you very much for that presentation, Rob. Now, our third and final speaker is Lalitha Ramachandran. She has extensive experience in sustainable urban design, climate adaptation and integrated water management. Recently, she was involved in developing integrated water management for Fisherman's Bend. And she worked for the City of Port Phillip for quite a long time working on these sorts of very relevant issues from 2005 to 2014. At that time, she worked in partnership with Monash University and City of Melbourne on mapping heat island effects, and with CSIRO to understand likely flood adaptation solutions. So this is a great opportunity to look into both of those issues that we've heard in the earlier presentations and to zone even more deeply into the local area. Welcome, Lalitha.
Can you hear me all? Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go through a lot of information very quickly, so hopefully I make sense. Okay, I'm going to go through some of the urban heat island work that was done at the City of Port Phillip between 2010 and 2013. As well as some of the future flood risks that we looked at the time. Then I'm going to look at a few solutions, what worked, what may not work, what might work in the future, as well as where we might be going with some of the planning and policy instruments that are starting to come out at state level. So how do we live with more heat? Let's start by looking at some of the maps that we got at the time. This is, these maps were captured in 2012, they're available on the website. The resolution levels here don't show you much, it's just a pretty picture up there for now. What we did do was send a plane up in the middle of the day as well as the middle of the night to try and capture what urban heat island effects were doing through the city during the day as well as the night. At the same time, there was a multispectral map captured, which gave us 9 different surfaces, including roof types, irrigated vegetated land, unirrigated vegetated land, and that allowed us to put emissivity levels on each of those and get some understanding of what are we dealing with. Anyway, daytime map, here we go. You can see it's a hot city, except for around the Albert Park Lake. Nighttime, can you see all those tiny blue spots, particularly down south? Don't kid yourself, that's air conditioning going straight up through the roofs. So it gives you some perspective. Now this is just very initial work. So what it did start to give us, there is a tool that the city, I believe, makes available to residents to use to do your own kind of planning. But what I'm going to talk through in the next little while is what this meant for the city of Port Phillip as well as nearby regions. So the first thing you've got to consider is the physical challenges of living in an inner urban wonderful space like this. There's something wrong with that chart title because the roads are actually parks and the parks are actually roads, but 26% parks, 22% roads, 52% private property. That's you and me in our houses or our workspaces. That's a really important thing to keep in mind as we keep going through. So once we start looking at the solutions, urban forest, as Nigel brought up, is one of the key solutions. Why? It creates coolth because of evapotranspiration. This city particularly, city of Port Phillip, because I grew up here as a teenager, then I was back here and worked with the city for a few years, many years later, has always had a debate for as long as I can remember about whether it's indigenous species that we put into street trees or whether it's European species. This was a game changer for me because what it told us was evapotranspirative species are where we need to go. Now that doesn't mean you go out and you talk to council and say, please start putting elm trees and plane trees everywhere because they're not going to survive in 100 years' time. So the challenge now is to actually try and find more evapotranspirative species that might accommodate to more Mediterranean conditions a few degrees warmer. They work very well. There was a lot of measurement that was done at the time. We didn't just look at emissivity levels with the thermal flights. We also had weather stations as well as field cameras to capture some of the temperature and some of the prevalent wind patterns and what it did in the city. And very definitely the other key thing that canopy does is provide shade. Now the second thing is water in the landscape, critical. So you can't get that evapotranspiration without water in the landscape, and water sensitive urban design is an excellent way to do it. Problem is, remember that map I showed you with 52% private properties? That's you and me sitting in there. And this bit can only go on the streets. That's 22%. It's not going to do it if you rely on public realm. So the bottom line is this is a joint effort, people. We're looking at all of us actually looking at how we green up our neighbourhoods inside the fence line, on the building, as well as out on the street. And here are some starting solutions that are starting to emerge. Certainly with Fisherman's Bend, green infrastructure's on the table as a primary component for multi-res and high-rise developments. City of Melbourne and City of Port Phillip have been doing quite a bit of work on this front, and I understand state government actually has recently come out with urban heat island guidelines and a tool, and they're certainly moving in that direction. So I'm going to very quickly bring up something called the Stormwater Ministerial Advisory Committee recommendations that were prepared in 2018. Sweeping, huge, 137 something, somebody correct me, 150 odd recommendations, one of which also gives councils a starting point for enabling green infrastructure in local planning schemes. So we're starting to move there. Finally, somewhere we may need to go in the future, this is what they're doing in Singapore. Resilient walkways. So Singapore's hot, humid, rainy and sunny most of the time. And what they're starting to do is to create walkways all the way through that actually enable you to traverse those climate extremes during the middle of the day. I recently took a walk when I was visiting about 6 months ago in the middle of the day. And I've developed an autoimmune condition, so I fry. It's very funny watching a brown person walk with an umbrella, but that's what I did. I didn't need it too often because of the amount of resilient walkways that already started developing. So there's some ideas. How am I going for time?
Got 8 minutes left.
Okay, very fast. Now, how do we move on to living with more water? We know that there's 3 ways to get wet in the city of Port Phillip. You get water from upstream and you're at the bottom of the catchment. You get rainfall and stormwater here. and you've built, you know, it's highly impermeable, and bottom of the catchment again, and you're coastally vulnerable, as Gell demonstrated. And we also know that today's floods are tomorrow's tides, and this is the important thing with a lot of the records that are coming in at the moment. When you see that water coming up, and you see it sitting on top of Elwood Canal, the reality is once we start getting much higher sea levels, we're going to see that pretty much inundated all the time, and very, very small amounts of rainfall will cause a problem. So when we look at what falls, your big storms will be more frequent later in the century, but right now it's the Jerry's milk bars that get the problem. It's the smaller, more frequent storm events that cause the most damage collectively. Okay? So back in between 2011 and 2013, we worked with CSIRO to develop an integrated future flood model for the city. And what it did was look at catchment, and combined catchment and coastal flood modelling, and we did not consider what was coming down from upstream. Otherwise, we would have had to map all the way up the catchment and get their data as well, and that was too hard. We analysed the outputs in terms of the extent of flooding, the depth of flooding, the duration and the speed, so hydraulic and hydrological modelling. I'm going to go through this very quickly. So current day, we know full well that Elwood, Middle Park, Beacon Cove, South Melbourne tends to get nuisance flooding. And the light blue patch that you can see there is pretty much where it gets it. So yeah, Jerry's milk bar is the epicentre. The summary, it's once you get to 0.4 metre sea level rise, you start to see some quite significant flooding around Elwood Canal and South Melbourne. So it sits around for a lot more than 2 hours, and that starts to become significant. Once you get to now 0.8 metres sea level rise, this is with a storm surge, so perfect modelling, it never quite works this way, then a rain event. The dark blue doesn't matter, that's just rain, but quite a bit of flooding left at the end of that. Okay. And the analysis is you're starting to get quite severe flooding around Elwood Canal and South Melbourne with well over 6 hours water retained. So that's going to cause damage. So what we did was we looked at some solutions, and we focused primarily on the public realm, but we also looked at the private realm. So what did we look at? We looked at street retention. We went bold. We took over Elstonwick Park. We pretended we took over Elstonwick Park. We created this large-scale retention and detention system there. We assumed household retention detention through regulatory processes of 5,000 litres per household. We put back valves or tide gates on 96 outfalls all along the canal, and that was to stop water going straight back up the canal. Onto streets, which is what happened in 2011, and we put street retention detention systems, which are hugely expensive and currently don't go down, in about 3 different streets. And this is what we found. Current day, obviously, it worked beautifully. To the left, you can see no flooding. At 0.4 metres sea level rise, you can see that it still works pretty well. Once you get to 0.8 metres sea level rise, bing bong. Right, so what this tells us immediately is 2 things. First and foremost, the traditional ways in which we would have looked at protecting drainage and the infrastructure formats that we currently use may not work. Design life does not last as long. You put down one of those tide valves, you technically assume your drainage system is going to last for another 80 years, 100 years. That's usually what the asset design life is. All of a sudden you're seeing something that may not last for half that long. So where do we go from here? Well, we don't want Jerry's milk bar to have too much more of that. We don't want to lose our coastlines, as we said before. And we know full well we've built in a swampy area. So let's try adaptation. What do we mean by that? It means that we start to look at it from a risk adaptation perspective rather than a risk-averse perspective. And by this I mean that we need to start thinking quite differently about what we live in and how we live with more and more water over time. It definitely means progressive adaptation. So you heard what Rob said earlier. The reality is we can build for some things and we can protect against some things, but there's a very good chance that in 50 and 80 and 100 years' time, you're going to be looking at new adaptation solutions, and of course, lots of new technological advances would have happened by then as well. Again, the same problem. Private realm needs to be a big part of the solution. So what we do on our properties makes a big difference. I brought up water-sensitive urban design for water in the landscape for urban heat island. The reality is it also makes a big difference in terms of managing some of those storm flows. And it can actually make a big difference to us creating an environment that enables more green infrastructure as well as some flood management. It is not a flood management tool in itself, though. Some ideas of emerging resilient streetscapes would literally mean that we would possibly consider getting rid of heritage in some streets. Possibly. Something for you to discuss. But it means that you keep 80% of your heritage in other streets. Is that worth it? Maybe. Is it worthwhile starting to create more of a canal estate in some parts of the municipality? Don't put your hand up for riverfront views just yet, but it does make sense because it removes some of the pressure from the creek, and it does mean we live slightly differently from the way we do at the moment. Another controversial idea would be floating houses. Why not? You know, as the creek goes up, and over time, we can either fight against that and start building walls, which don't necessarily work, or we can start moving towards what are the resilient building forms that could work in that space. What does it mean for drainage and very different drainage solutions? Where do we end conventional drainage and where do we start new drainage techniques and decentralised systems? And of course, coastal defences. While I wouldn't suggest going out and planting mangroves in front of Elwood Beach tomorrow, this is definitely one of the ways that we've modelled in the work that I've done with South East Water down in Western Port Bay that we're looking at in terms of reducing coastal erosion as well as creating a storm defence. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lalitha. I think it really is a big challenge, isn't it? That there are things that need to be done by decision makers, governments, corporations, etc. But there are also things that other people have to do, or allow to happen to them in terms of the level of change that's required to deal with climate change. So that's been a really interesting presentation from Lalitha. Now we're going to have some questions in a minute, but there's meant to be some buckets going around to help raise money to cover the costs of today, but also help to fund future events. So can I just ask people to maybe get out your wallets and things like that on the ready for that? Also, if you'd like to ask a question, then there are microphones on either side of the balcony in the middle. So it would be a good idea if you've got a question that you want to ask to start to go up to that space on either side. You can see the men with the microphones. We're going to be arranging a table over here so that we can get our speakers back in the room so that they can answer your questions.
Just going up to Canberra in April for a conference. I've just been notified that poor Canberra that had all this smoke for all those weeks. They got absolutely smashed with the whole place where I was going to stay. So they're going to destroy it. All the time. It's a bummer because it jumped in straight away. So
So we're going to get our speakers back into position. So just while we're getting ready to go into the next session, so it really is, we're really aiming to get the most benefit out of speakers today. So questions are very welcome. If someone actually wants to make a statement, and we know how attractive that is as an idea, just make it really succinct, okay? Because I know we've already got a number of people queuing up for questions, so let's really try to be disciplined about that and make them nice and succinct. Okay.
you're allowed one brief. Yeah, thank you.
No.
Now, how's that? Is that fantastic? All right, so I'm going to take a question from this side of the room first, and then we'll go to the next side.
Hello, I'm Frida Relics. Fantastic presentation. I've got a question and an idea for Lalitha. A couple of us have been trying to badger the council into that interesting space called the Verge in America and the Nature Strip in Australia, where it's actually owned by council, I understand, but administered by people. And we would like them to encourage, as City of Vincent does in Western Australia, they help citizens plant out their verges, whether within, they lean towards Indigenous, but whatever is recommended. So that's my question. Is that a sort of a good short-term idea?
I'd like to think that it's not only a good short-term idea, it's a good long-term idea, because similar to what you were saying about Singapore, you'd be providing a shade path along the footpath that would provide. At that micro scale, the most important thing you can do to provide cooling to the body is to shade from direct radiation, to reduce the mean radiant temperature of the body. And if you create a shadeway, rather than, most of our verges are quite open, apart from the odd tree, create a shadeway, much more comfortable. But I also know that there are some, in some places there are cultural issues about treeing roadsides and public paths like that, because some people actually don't think that there is a security issue around that too. Not just culturally, but there are people that actually take that view that it's a security issue. But overall, I think it's a wonderful idea.
May I extend the idea? Vic Roads spends about $33 million a year mowing grass on roads. Serious. They spray weeds with glyphosate and they call it a carbon offset. Believe it or not. There's a small group, including myself, trying to work to get them to actually think about redesigning median strips on roads and actually making roads safer by using vegetation to protect vehicles that might come off the roads, absorbing impacts and things like that. This is the sort of sensible stuff we need to be doing, not only to cool down our cities, but for biodiversity value as well.
Okay, no, I'm going to keep hand this to Lalitha and then we go to another question.
Very briefly, I think spot on, especially when it comes to green infrastructure. Look, quite frankly, I don't think council would have an objection provided there are no liability issues and provided there's a good enough organisation. Well, by liability issues, I mean putting something that becomes a trip hazard or some other issue. But bottom line, as long as that's working, we've got back lanes that your properties lead back to. We've got a lot of canyon streets where you've got a building right on the street. These are the places to try this stuff.
Okay, thank you. That's a great idea, and I'm sure there's discussion about that. Now over to this side of the room.
Yes, I've been living in Elwood for over 20 years. When I first moved in, we all had backyards. We grew vegetables. We shared them. Over those 20 years, most of those backyards have disappeared for development. Trees have gone. Birds have gone. Recently, I'm behind the Elwood High School. 22 trees were knocked down. 600 square metres of grass gone for asphalt. No consultation with the community at all. My question is, why should I not move to Tasmania?
Right, maybe because you'll be joining me and other people who are all making a move. But does anyone, this is a real issue because we're kind of swimming against the tide here. Like on the one hand, we say we need more of this, but actually there's still these very strong forces that are wanting to bulldoze these things for asphalt.
Business, developers, council to get more rates. And the ugliness of the buildings. I live in an 83-year-old house. It's still standing. Most of those won't be around for the next 10 or 15 years.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm very angry.
Very quickly, yep, we've gone against the tide and all the sensible things that you're talking about. I'm starting to see that tide turn. So more recently, there has been the release of the Better Apartment Garden fire, canopy rain garden sections. So you can't build block to block anymore, technically. Right? Secondly, we've got, well, it takes a while for that to percolate, If you go with, I hope nobody works for Metricon here, but if you work for Metricon or some other company, the reality is you've got cookie cutter houses. They go down, nobody's objected to them, they keep going down. There's a cost benefits analysis that's done in somebody's backyard, and that's the way it's been forever. But we're starting to see some change, and it's partly because of exactly that, the fact that we actually do need coof and we need amenity.
One of the things we know about what that does, this densification, we know that it increases urban warmth. We've got really good modelling evidence to show that. There are some, well, I don't know if there are great reasons for urban densification, but one of them is probably not a bad one, and that is to reduce urban sprawl into otherwise productive rural land beyond the city. However, I think that's not the only thing going on. So what densification requires, if it is going to proceed, it needs to proceed with really clear guidelines about green cover. So most of our inner city councils, including the City of Melbourne, have a green cover target. They want 40% vegetated by 2040. In actual fact, they've been going backwards before they can go forwards, mainly because of this densification issue. City of Burundara and many of the other inner city areas.
In the EU, public buildings with flat roofs, green roofs are mandatory.
Yes.
Mandatory.
So on to the next question over this side.
Oh, good day. No, I'm not going to steal it, don't worry. Well, you kind of nicked my question in some ways. It's a bit frustrating. Melbourne's the biggest city in Australia, probably, and it's rapidly expanding, and we're going to have higher densities. I mean, it's just going to happen. Just get over it at some levels and adapt to live with it. But what I was going to ask you is that both Altona and Elwood are the most susceptible areas to flooding with a rise in sea level. What can we do about it? Just, please, practical examples. What can we do now or in the next 10 to 20 years?
So one of those, before I hand it over, there was actually a question that went to the website that said, well, why don't we just increase the height of the seawall? So that's a practical kind of solution. So maybe can you answer both of those questions at the same time?
Right. Seawalls don't work. It's as simple as that. There's prevalent winds. There's a range of other components in terms of wanting to get the water out, as well as we love our beaches. And at the end of the day, you also love the views, and I don't think we want to be hedged in by walls. But more importantly, they don't actually necessarily work. They don't work. What we're looking at more and more is some of the examples that are in other parts of the world. They include, as I pointed out, coastal defences like mangroves. There's actually a range of examples in terms of creating beach berm as well as using polders, which are basically storm surge defences. So what they do is they reduce the power of that storm surge onto the coastline. At the moment, you've got a whole heap of very beautiful houses, and some of them are very expensive. We may have to lose some of that stock, but in the long run, I would argue that if we're prepared to actually work within those considerations, there's no reason why we can't actually live better with things like polders, coastal wetlands, as well as some floating components to the city.
Short answer is you can't. Like the boy with the finger in the dike. The Dutch are doing the best. They've got whole cities below sea level, but they've been working on it through most of my lifetime, and they do have floating cities. But the reality is our cities weren't designed with that in mind, and they're really difficult to protect now. The Brits, for example, looking at their entire coastline, 10% of their coast are actually reorganising shorelines, so getting the bulldozers out and reorganising shorelines. About another 40% they're actually doing heavy construction, so big walls around important infrastructure, and the other 50% let her rip.
Okay, over to this side.
Hello, panel and everybody who's here. My name's McCain, I live in St Kilda. Thank you very much for your time and your expertise. It's been brilliant. This issue is clearly incredibly urgent. My question to you is this: given your expertise, what are the top 3 things we can take to council? And I notice I don't think there's any councillors here, are there? Is there? Great. What message can we give these councillors that says we vote? These 3 things will work and they need to be done before you leave off, immediately. What would be those 3 things, please?
Well, one thing I noticed from one of Lalitha's early slides that the temperature at the top of MSAC was 75 degrees. I don't know what the air temperature was on that day, but in our business, I think we've got about 14 to 15 good products we represent now. One of them is a membrane waterproofing reflective coating. So if you think of a stranded or corrugated iron roof, on a 35-degree day, that roof will get to close to 100 degrees centigrade. Your solar panels on the same roof will decrease their performance by 60% because of the heat. This coating will keep that roof to 41 degrees and waterproof your roof. I mean, that's the sort of thing, councils just have to understand that they've got to make that mandatory. And this climate emergency is calling it one thing, then what are you going to do? This is an extreme emergency. I've been a local government councillor, and I was probably one of the most frustrating things I ever did in my life. But it's a very difficult job because you've got to bring the whole community along with you, and it's a huge balancing act. But we actually need to understand. If I use Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber from Potsdam Institute, he actually says, in terms of our cities, if we're serious about +2 degrees, we need to start shutting down brown coal power stations globally from today. We've got 10 years to phase out the internal combustion engine and electrify everything. And then from 2030, we have to build our cities again out of timber, stone and clay.
And chemistry.
Serious. Cross-laminated timber, bricks and hewn stone. Unless we can move, as Ross Garner is suggesting in his superpower book, unless we can make steel and cement from green hydrogen. We cannot afford to continue to build our cities. So think about, just when you turn off the light tonight, think about how many factories you know being made with concrete walls. The embedded energy in that cement is off scale. Cement emits the same emissions as ships and airplanes combined. We have to stop building things out of cement and steel unless we can work out, as Sanjeev Gupta's doing in Wales, to make the steel from renewable energy.
So we've got one which is really about focusing on building materials and the way we build our cities. I believe that you've got one for us.
Sorry, Rob, except MSAC is managed at the state level. So,
well, work it out.
But for me, the two remaining things would be, first and foremost, there is coastal sea level rise data that will be available because Port Phillip Bay is just being, the modelling for Port Phillip Bay is being completed by CSIRO at the moment with the state government. It would be timely for the city to reconsider what that means and whether that earlier data that we showed you is demonstrating similar outcomes. The second is to adopt a planning strategy, planning condition around enabling green infrastructure. And I do believe that quite a lot of work is actually being done. I hope I haven't stolen council's thunder.
Thank you. And Nigel, did you have a...
Well, perhaps just, I agree with everything that's been said. Perhaps just add a little bit more to the business of roofing materials. The work that we've done on modelling reductions to urban temperatures, so urban air temperatures across Melbourne, we get the best benefit by combining cool roofs, in other words, increasing the albedo of roofs, making them more reflective. That plus increased vegetation cover and watering the vegetation we have. And that requires harvesting wintertime spring water. So if you put those things together, under extreme temperatures, we can reduce the city temperature by a bit over 2 degrees. You get a little bit from quite a bit from cool roofs, quite a bit from veg, and quite a bit from the effective irrigation. Combine them all together, that makes it a big difference.
That's a mean 2 degrees?
That's a mean 2 degrees across the city during the day.
Great, thank you. All right, back over to this side.
Hello, I'm Anita Horvath. I live in Port Melbourne. I'd like to thank the panel and PECAN for organising this wonderful event. I haven't been so scared and stimulated in a long time, simultaneously. My question is particularly to Lalitha and Nigel. What advice do you give about how we can reconcile the drying of southeastern Australia and the increased heat which Melbourne faces and drought conditions with watering the greening that we need to do to mitigate the heat island effect?
That's a very good question. The current, Melbourne's long-term average rainfall, well, it depends where you are. It grades considerably from west to east, from 400 odd millimetres long-term average to 800 or more. But if we say that the long-term average is 650 millimetres, in the last 10 or 15 years, we've been averaging more like 450 millimetres. So our rainfall has probably dropped by about a third. It will go up and down a bit, but broadly it seems to have dropped. And that's mainly because we're no longer getting the autumn and winter rainfall from mid-latitude depressions and cold fronts. So, but however, that 450 millimetres is still quite a resource of water. So what happens traditionally in cities is any water that falls on the city is immediately captured into stormwater drains and discharged. And that's been the engineering solution for the last 300 years. What we need to be able to do though, even 400 millimetres amounts to a huge amount of water across the city. If we harvest a proportion of that, plus reuse grey water, then it almost exactly balances, or more than balances, the water we take from our catchments. So we have this much larger water resource than we really imagine. We can then keep it and use it as best we can to support vegetation. Even vegetation that's not supported by irrigation is better than no vegetation at all. But when you have evapotranspiring vegetation, it's a really effective cooler.
To add to that, yeah, water in the landscape, there's no question about it. At the moment, we throw away virtually everything that we treat. We have some of the highest treatment standards for water, for recycled water in the world. We treat it and we throw it away, because we've got a state policy that basically favours groundwater and subsidised prices for a lot of industry and farming. That's slowly changing, but I would argue that we've also got a lot of opportunity, and we might have missed the boat a little bit, but you know, all that road building and metro works would have been wonderful to see conduits going everywhere for third pipe. And Fisherman's Bend is looking at this, by the way. So the cities at the moment, working with Melbourne Water and South East Water, are planning to utilise exactly that sort of format as a starting point. But what we need to see is that taken to the outer suburbs, because that's where Melbourne at 8 million is going to be looking at both urban heat island as well as bushfire risk. And I'd argue that third pipe has got a massive role to play in keeping water in the landscape and both heat and fire at bay.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you. So back over to this side.
Hello. There are a lot of solutions that you mentioned, or alluded to, but nobody has actually mentioned a ballpark figure. Is it, if we're going to avoid, say, flooding in Elwood in 40 years' time, are we talking about 50 million, 500 million, 5 billion? And I think the total property value in Port Phillip is not 35 trillion, it's 35 billion, I think. Yeah, yeah, 35 trillion is 20 times the GDP of Australia.
It's closer to billions, because in the state government, when I was on coastal council, I think they had like 4 million or 7 million in the state budget for coastal protection, for the entire coast. Right? That builds you one rock droid at Southie Street.
The reason I mentioned the 35 billion is because ultimately that determines if it's Port Phillip who's going to pay, or if it's the state who's going to pay, or if it's Australia who's going to pay.
Good question.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is that it's like you know, there's a sort of it's a bit of one of those debates that you have about how much is it going to cost, but it's the weighing up the cost of not acting with acting, and then getting everyone on board with acting and deciding this is what we're going to do, and we're just going to have to find the money for it, because we actually find the money for all sorts of stuff all the time. So,
and I think there's a couple of critical components in terms of the amount of how much we can do in our own backyards. The reality is most of this land is sitting in our hands, not at state level or at local government level. So it's all about how we get private properties to start working in with a public system that enables what you're talking about. That's going to cost over time, and it's also progressive. So if you consider that over time you're modifying, you're actually distributing the cost quite a bit.
sorry, I just qualify that. I'm not suggesting we don't do it.
No, no.
I'm just suggesting I just want to know the actual cost.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I think it's going to have to be borne by
Everyone.
more than Port Phillip.
Well, I think that's the conversation we're not having.
Yeah, that's right.
Hello, my name is Gale. Thank you. Truly appreciate the concise information you brought to us this afternoon. I wasn't going to ask a question, but the first person asking brought up greening verges. So I just have popped up because I've experienced a recent example of council rejection of residents' attempts to irrigate a verge or a nature strip on Milton Road. And I won't go into the reasons why we were asking for it, but council came back and said if we were to put a tap there, it would cost us $5,000, and we can't justify that. So I know, Lalitha, you were saying that the council should be able to try and assist residents if they wanted their verges greened, but there seems to be a disconnect between the over-watering of some areas of Port Phillip and an inability to create design and pay for those designers, so that residents like ourselves who do want their verges irrigated and create these green pathways that you showed us, that could happen. And it seems like we're in the ideal situation as a case study in Port Phillip to do this for the rest of Australia.
So thank you for that. I think we might just leave that one with the council who are here to take away.
Can I make a quick comment? 200 years of unbroken democracy in this country have filamented decision-making so substantially, we're now moribund. We can't make decisions because we've got too many decision makers at all sorts of levels. We shouldn't be discussing one single tap for $5,000. It should be a council policy that says, how do we irrigate all of the roadside verges, and how do we promote habitat biodiversity across the entire city, and look at it, that scale, work out what that budget is rather than looking at the cost of a single tap.
Hi, I'm David. Thank you. I totally understand greening our own gardens, our own space. I understand parks and gardens. I understand if neighbours, I've had a lot of trouble with neighbours cutting down all their trees and putting up black metal buildings and pools. And I've fought some of that, and the council have done the best they can. I understand it's difficult for council. Or in parks, if I see trees coming down, I'm happy to climb them, and I have a right because it's a public park. However, what do we do when a piece of land is not under the jurisdiction of the council, is not private land, but is owned by someone that the council have no jurisdiction over? Quick example, this school. Quick example, the back of this school. Quick example, they've just mowed down 8 huge trees, each supplying enough oxygen for a family of 4 for a year, and taken up all the grass and they're putting in bitumen. Now, the locals can do nothing. I spoke to Dick Gross. He said he could do nothing. The council could do nothing because it's owned by the Education Department, and the Education Department have done a deal with the Melbourne Cricket Club. It's happening all over. It's happened a lot in Victoria. It's a loophole they've found. Nobody can stop it. A lot of communities are outraged. We've lost a lot of trees, and we're putting in a lot of bitumen. So what I want to know is, it must change. It's a dinosaur. But who do you go to when the council don't have control of it, and there's been a deal done between a corporate organisation and a department like the Education Department, and the public, even though they know it's wrong, are shut out? Would you have any suggestions?
There are currently Victorian Government parliamentary inquiry into school infrastructure, which I found out about 10 days ago. So they're floundering around doing whatever they think they're doing, and they need to understand those issues, and they just don't. So that, I mean, Victorian Schools Building Authority I've had some experience with. They don't operate fast. We used to call Melbourne Water Melbourne Glacier, but BSBA is in the space, and there's that thing between Department of Treasury and Finance, and they just don't understand those issues. The parliamentary inquiry into schools infrastructure is an opportunity to work at that high level because they're redesigning all that stuff.
The other thing is that the schools obviously have a duty of care to our children, and our children are spending a lot of time at school, middle of the day, summertime. They really do need to be looking after those trees and be really.
I'd seen children under the trees in the shade, but I was told by the school that they need a hockey court because they might.
Well, and if it is a synthetic green hockey, that's the hottest surface material you can find anywhere. Those green grass synthetic.
None of us have been able to stop it because we've all been told, sorry, it's a deal. It's all done. We've had no help. A whole lot of things we asked for, we haven't received none. So basically, it's happening right here. This is the irony to me of this meeting. I love it and I thank you all. But right under our noses is the antithesis. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Hi, g'day, my name's James. Thank you guys for this opportunity. One of my first jobs was here in Elwood, at Elwood Health and Vault. I'm not sure if anyone remembers it. And I also work across the road from Jerry's Film Club as a gardener. So it is quite funny seeing how much the population has kind of changed over the years. But I think the core principles of the environment have always been pretty strong. My question's kind of in three parts. First off, is there a way that everyone, all the stakeholders within like this bioregion could collaborate with Emergency Management Victoria? Because at the moment they're talking about community resilience being our best course of action against these disaster risks. Any platforms that you guys can work on or operate on that exist at the moment?
Any ideas about that?
Just a very brief comment about ambulance services that are actually tied in, of course, and they are extremely aware of, for example, the impact of heat on hospital admissions, but also the fact that the demand for ambulance services varies dramatically across the city, and that it's tied very much to the quality of the local environment. So I think you would find that, you know, Ambulance Victoria and to a large extent the Health Department would also be an ally, but I don't know if that's quite enough.
Sorry, Emergency Management Victoria is actually a federal, a legislative action, kind of like at the point of if there's a disaster happening, they take more of like martial law type angles. So it's not so much the fireys or the emergency services like the police.
Well, that's Andrew Crisp's job. He coordinates all of those. It's a really difficult job. That's a good. It would require some coordination, James, which is not an easy thing to achieve. But that's where that sits. EMV is trying to coordinate those things, but I can guarantee you what you're talking about is not part of their coordination plan. It should be.
It's one of their key principles that they're actually working towards,
right.
With adaptation and mitigation, about lowering the risk and trying to get communities active, because the communities themselves know where the risks are. I'm sure we all can speak for ourselves where we know where the puddles are. But as far as it goes for mechanisms for all stakeholders, from government, community groups like yourselves, and even when it comes to investment, similar to where's the money going to come from, I think there's a good opportunity for, say, green bonds and green investment from the private sector that are willing to jump into these types of long-term investments that, with the risks that we're going through, will pay out in the long run through like insurance and cost of living and everything.
So Lalitha,
It's a huge question that you've asked, quite complex too. So let me break it down in two parts very briefly and give you back a response that hopefully starts to cover some of it. Emergency Management Australia, you're right, is federal. To be honest, in 10 or 12 years, that ambition has not changed. We're We've seen awards for work that's resilient. We're not necessarily seeing a resilience response to, say, rebuilding in bushfire areas, or for that matter, rebuilding in coastal areas that have been devastated by erosion. At the same time, I definitely think that's a starting point in terms of setting some of the rules at a national level in terms of rebuilding and emergency funds. But that's where it starts and ends. When they talk about community, I'm sorry, I'm one of those people who's quite cynical about that, because what they're saying is, hey, guess what, our responsibility is your responsibility because it's your house. That works in a lot of other states because the planning conditions are different. In Victoria, they're quite centralised, so the reality is we're still all in the game together, and local governments take a lot more responsibility than they might. They have to work from a state perspective as well as a local perspective, whereas, say, for example, in New South Wales, I could, as a council, set a different standard from the council right next to me. So just, you know, a little bit of work there. At a local level, very briefly, 2011, when we had the floods, there were people out there ringing council up and saying, where the heck was State Emergency Services? They turned up 16 hours after we called. Well, that's because they do a triage service. They're all volunteers, just like bush firefighters, and they, you know, they've got to work with what's important. There are other people who said they cut the tree down, but they didn't stack it up as firewood next to my house. This is how far we are from understanding how you do voluntary services for flood at a local level.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So now over to the side of the room.
My name is Malcolm. I'm a local ratepayer in Port Phillip. We've talked a lot about resilience and actions to mitigate the problems. It strikes me that there should be a place in the forum for preventing the disease rather than curing it. And the comment was earlier made about 200 years of unbroken democracy. I think it might be commented as 200 years of broken democracy, insofar as the fact that it has been unable for 30 years to change at the federal level the complete lack of progress. It talks about targets of 2050 rather than actions this year. And the question that comes out at the end of this is, where does council fit in this paradigm shift that's required? And we have the ideal opportunity at the moment in an Overton window present regarding public opinion following the bushfires. Action seems to be necessary now, rather than waiting for business as usual to develop situations that we have to manage. The question is, what is council's attitude to changing the way politics is done?
Yeah, I guess that's a hard one for us to answer because we're not representing council. But I think that there are people from council here today who've been hearing the speakers, hearing the questions, and getting a strong sense of the concern that people have, and also that there clearly needs to be change in so many different areas in the way people do business. So council's part of that, not solely. Nigel?
Just a comment, but not from a council perspective. But the Millennium Drought was an opportunity to shift government policy. And just like the Millennium Drought, I think these last years of drought and the fire emergency has also been another opportunity to actually try and do something about government policy. So I know that a lot of my fellow scientists have been taking opportunities to do what they can to lever public opinion and to use the science to actually address this issue of government inaction. So myself, as a climate scientist, along with a bunch of fire scientists, we wrote a document that picked up another 600 signatures from other climate scientists and fire scientists around the world that was delivered to government about two weeks ago. Don't know what will come of it, but at least we're trying to do that, and it is an opportunity.
Local government is not dissimilar to the federal government. Most of the staff, the officers, are really well educated on this stuff and know what to do. most of the work that I've done over the last 20 years with local government has been CEOs and planners with jobs in local government saying, Rob, can you please come and talk to our councillors? They don't get it. Now you guys vote for, we need to do it federally, state and at local government level. You now need to use your vote, instead of just voting on the economy, which most of us can't balance their monthly bank card account. We actually need to vote on this critical issue and put councillors in place that understand the issues.
So we've got 4 more minutes for this section of the forum. So, and there's only 2 more questions. So they're going to be a quick question and a quick answer.
Okay, my name's Tony from Brighton, and just following up from that idea and that question, in relation to what councils could do now, does the panel think it would be a good idea for councils not only to address the coming heat, fire and flood that we're all facing, but to act now and examine their banking arrangements so that they do not bank with banks that fund fossil fuel industries? And further, that people in this forum could actually write to their councillors of the City of Bayside and the City of Port Phillip and actually request that council examine their finances and divest from those kind of banks and financial institutions.
So, yeah, take that as a suggestion. Coming from you, that seems to have a lot of support from participants. Does anyone have any self-divestment? No?
No. Jeff, for the program, divest.
I'm actually a councillor, and I just wanted to stand up and let you know some of the things that you're suggesting we're already doing, but we always want more suggestions, so please feel free to contact us. We do have that policy around our banking already in City of Port Phillip. I just wanted to let you know, especially for people in Elwood, that look, council moves slowly. But we are working with Bayside Council at Elstonwood Park North to look at how we can capture water to water parks, but also to reduce the flooding, and also working with the first time across 4 councils with Kingston and Glen Ira, because Elster Creek starts back up in there, and working with them. And look, it's a long-term goal to get planning that they have to capture all their water on new builds so it doesn't come down to us. We've put some of those back valves into the canal already. Fisherman's Bend is that blue-green infrastructure, it's planned that way. Look, it is hard because no one wants to lose car parks, but there is that thinking of putting more greening in. Obviously, financials, there's a limit with our budget, but a lot of the stuff that you're suggesting we're already doing. You can plant on verges. There is policy though for insurance reasons. Have I missed anything, Tim and Kat? There's a lot of stuff we are doing. I just want to let you know that we're not listening. It's just very slow to deliver, but we'd love it if you planted trees in your gardens. That would be huge. But we are working on it, but of course there's always more we can do. We totally get that.
Woo! All right. For the question and answer section, I'm sorry because I know that a couple of questions. Well, it is now time to actually move on to the last bit because we're nearly out of time, so I'm sorry. But I would say that I think that was great to hear from the council, and it seems to me that it's a really good opportunity to actually have a council or a joint council information session where you can get, people have got a lot of ideas on. So at this stage, I would like to hand back to Rhonda, but I would really like to say a great big thank you to PECAN and BCCAG for doesn't roll off the tongue, but for putting today's session together. It's been incredibly interesting and valuable, and hopefully it's not the last such conversation. There'll be more conversations, and everyone should get involved in those 2 groups because they're fantastic.
Thanks very much, Esther. As Esther said, my name's Rhonda Small, and I've been involved in PECAN representing the Community Alliance of Port Phillip, which is one of the member groups. And it's my great privilege on behalf of all of us here today to thank our speakers, Nigel Tapper, Rob Gell and Lalitha Ramachandran, and our moderator, Esther Abrams. I'm sure you'll agree that they've given us much food for thought and action as together we face the challenges of climate change and its impacts for our local communities. And we have some small gifts to express our gratitude to each of you, including some delicious pecan tarts baked by Peter Moredas of Sopadani. I really hope you'll enjoy those tonight with your family or friends. Thank you all for the time, the expertise and the insights that you've shared with us today. Now, lots of people helped put today's event together, but I especially want to thank Josh Burns, our federal MP, who was here earlier, for some assistance with the printing. Thanks too to the SRC at Elwood here for supporting and promoting the event at the school. And an extra special thank you to Simon Cosma for his terrific design work. I think you'll agree it's stunning. And we're really delighted that so many of you have attended today, and we hope that you go away inspired to take action. And there are a number of suggestions for action on the yellow sheets on the back of the PECAN sheet, some of which have been mentioned in the comments and questions already. And one of those is includes joining one of the local groups who are active on climate change issues in our 2 municipalities. So do stop and talk to the Port Phillip and Bayside groups who have stands outside, and consider joining whichever group aligns best with your interests. Only together can we build the momentum needed for change. Yay. I'd also like to remind you that 2020 is a council election year, and come October, voting for candidates who are committed to local action to address the climate crisis. We've got municipalities that have declared the climate emergency, so whoever stands in October, we need to go and talk to them about where they stand on this issue and what action they're prepared to take in the next council. And it's important you vote for those candidates who are going to do the best job for our municipalities. As Jack said earlier, some of you here may have expertise on climate issues that you'd like to share, and PECAN plans to establish an expert advisory group. So please do complete the blue form and hand it to Peter, who you just saw on the stage, on your way out, if there's expertise you'd like to contribute. Now, if you turn to the other side of the blue sheets, I'll read out the brief forum resolution that we prepared, and it's also on the screen. And then I'll put it to a vote via a show of hands. The citizens at this forum call upon the Port Phillip and Bayside councils and the state and federal governments to take the strongest possible climate action now to address the climate crisis we all face. All those in favour of that motion? Thank you. I think we've overwhelmingly passed that motion. And PECAN and BCCAG commit today to using this resolution to advocate with our councils and with state and federal government to convey to them our call for urgent action. Thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of the weekend. Thank you.